Hey, so that's Introduction to Folklore. Well, that's an introduction to folklore. There's a number of different ways that the course could have unfolded. It could have started basically a sort of historical account where you start looking at old stuff and indeterminate, and you focus it much more on perhaps around here. It becomes like an introduction to Canadian folklore. That would have been a way of doing it. And then we sort of go through what? Founding peoples, and we go through songs, and we go through story, and we go through craft, and that's one way of doing it. That's a completely legitimate way of doing it. But the way the course has been operating, hopefully, is that it emphasizes the notion that this is not an historical science, that yes, there is much history involved, that it is a reflection on, it is often a reflection of stuff of the past, things that are meaningful to us and for us because they are inheritances. They're inheritances from people that came before us and that fundamentally we kind of like and we kind of model ourselves on. We don't have to invoke such heavy words as ancestors or elders. We can. We totally can, but we don't have to. But basically, when we do these things that the folklorists identify as folklore, one of the things that we are doing is that we are happily adapting these patterns that have gone before us. That this is something. And by doing this something, we are making some kind of claim to some kind of continuity. The magical thing is that the continuities that we are making claim to, yes, they can be ethnic, they can be genetic inheritances, yes, they can be nationhood, which sometimes coincides and sometimes doesn't coincide with ethnic heritage and genetic ancestry. Yes, they can be linguistically based. Yes, they can be religiously based, but they can also be so many other dynamics. And that folklore, participating in these items of folklore, is one of the things that we do that affirms ourselves as being members of a group. That we begin in some kind of way, if I'm thinking about it right now, we begin in some kind of way by imitating, by adapting, by reflecting on those things that have gone before us and trying them ourselves. We move from being neophytes, we move from being initiates, and then we are slowly perhaps what we might start to call passive tradition bearers. We are audiences to this. And then on occasion, and not exhaustively, but we might select elements that we are much more active participants in. Active in terms of an engaged audience, active in terms of a demanding audience, and then active in terms of being practitioners. And not simply asking for the tradition to continue, but taking responsibility for that tradition. And one of the ways that we take responsibility for it is that we assess what is important about it. Is it important to me, to the group, collectively, that the traditions stay as faithful to what has gone before? And that's one of the aesthetics that we might bring. And we have a sort of fairly conservative idea of what tradition is. Is it? No, that it is this thing that needs to be constantly updated and constantly made meaningful. That the idea that there's a continuity with the past will nevertheless still be suggested, but it needs to be dynamic and flow, and there's adaptation is key to it. At which point we're sort of fairly dynamic ideas of tradition. And that the group will still be there even if the iterative practices are not exactly the same, because it is the group that gives those iterative practices life. And if by consensus the group says, yes, I grasp and I grant that this thing is slightly different from what has gone before, and yet it serves the same function, yes, it serves the same purpose, yes, it serves the same meaning, then it can continue. And so folklore becomes this way of constantly not simply reestablishing one's membership, one's citizenship within a folk group, but ultimately continuing to make an even greater claim to, and the folk group needs to be contemporary as well. And so it is both being shaped by and shaping the group through practices that might seem very strange to say when we're talking about things like your mom's soup. And it might be strange to say when we're talking about various forms of, how you're wearing your overalls, if the kids are wearing overalls these days. But is this constant participation, this pronouncement, this affirmation that one is participating in an identity that is informed by those of others, and yet it is not. It is a constructive claim to that. And of course, that we belong in multiple groups, that we belong in multiple identities that are in creative, wonderful tensions with each other. And we understand the mores. We deeply grasp that when we are in certain contexts, we have one set of repertoire and one set of social understanding, and we are fully fluent in being students, or we are fully fluent in being Italian Canadian, or we are fully fluent in being soccer players. We understand not simply the activities, the sort of the top down grasp of that, but the lived, rich interstitial life of membership in that group. And we also know that when we are with our soccer friends, we have a certain form of behavior and a certain form of stories and a certain form of shared worldview that we might not share with our family. And that's fine, because we are complex and intelligent and creative and joyful beings, and we can engage that complexity and that intelligence and that creativity and that joy in multiple different contexts, because that is what we do. So the course, it's 12 weeks. That's how courses work. And we start off with talking about basic ideas. Let's mess with this idea of tradition that you might have had. And then we start identifying the various groups that are often associated with it. And not an exhaustive list. We really don't talk about nationality. We don't talk about place that much because it's kind of implicit throughout. But we do talk about occupation. We talk about sort of the meanderings of childhood and how that changes ideas. And then we talk about the stuff. We do eventually talk about the stuff. We don't talk much about this because there's such a we're introducing you to a field of human activity that on one hand, you are very fluent in the content of it, and yet you are probably intensely naive about the technical vocabulary that the discipline that is called folklore has developed in order to understand it. And so it's just like, hey, these things that you do, people take these seriously, because actually this is where most of life is lived. So let's look at this sort of thing. Let's look at this thing like a discipline does, which is developing words and terms and relations and concepts that we can talk to various people who are talking about kind of the same thing in different contexts, can then have a conversation and make parallel judgments and test hypotheses from one situation to another and continue. And so that's what the discipline is. There are other folklore courses to take, and there are certainly there are areas that have been underexplored in this class that have entire sections devoted to them. We didn't talk much about material culture. We just really gave it a week, the folk objects. But material culture, ranging from handcraft to vernacular architecture, is a rich vein that one can study. We talked about folk narrative very briefly, but so many avenues for that. There is oral literature, where we talk about sort of in greater detail the mechanics of how a Märchen works. There's urban legend. Some of these are courses that are available here, and some of these are just avenues for further exploration. We barely touched on music, and of course folk music is a rich vein that we can cover in terms of how people respond to current events with songs that are about these sort of imminent communications, and then they enter into repertoires and they become less about the immediate moment and more about a sort of a sense of place and a sense of time and an ethos of a people, not to mention the fact that not everything is an immediate response, and sometimes people just write pretty things, because we do not always need to associate a function with things. We do not always need to understand or affirm that the generation of new things is for a particular functional purpose. The generation for new things can be basically because we have the opportunity to create, and we have the opportunity to create, and we have the opportunity to communicate not messages, or messages in terms of information, but messages in terms of sentiment. Like, so we can write new love songs, we can write new depression songs, we can write new odes to countryside because we can. Because it gives us joy when we create. And remember, we need to disavow ourselves of the idea that these things necessarily have to be functional, and that joy is a rationale for doing any of these things. That is, as I've said in the videos, that is a under theorized position, because it almost defies the gravitas that we typically think of when we think about the rationale, we think about theory. There's no real great theory of joy, so we just kind of need to remind ourselves of it, and one of these days someone will do it better, and then there'll be a reference that you can cite. So there's lots of stuff to talk about. There's also lots of stuff that you can do. Here's where I sort of give the 30-second spiel about what you can do with a folklore degree. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to direct you towards a recent book that came out, edited by Timothy Lloyd, and it contains 70 tiny essays. They're only about 3 or 4 pages each. I wrote one of them, but other people wrote others. And it's basically the folklorist as folklorists doing these other things. And it's all these people who, all of whom have folklore degrees, all of whom are engaged, have taken their folklore training and a folkloristic approach to the world and have applied it to different contexts. It is available in the library. I will put a link to it in the description. And then you can ponder that. And that isn't necessarily you should all drop what you're doing right now and sign up for a folklore major. That would be cool. And then maybe they would hire other people, and then I would have, colleagues, and that would be wonderful. And, we could have all these wonderful upper level courses, and you can just all get engaged. But we live in the real world, and it might be a hard sell. Nevertheless, you might be tempted to go, oh, okay. Because I've said time and again, when I say it to administrators, when I say it to students, I'm not necessarily encouraging everybody in the world to become a folklorist. But I do encourage people to think of the world folkloristically, to think of the world as, for the large part, your world, your day-to-day existence is largely lived in close communication with other people that is hopefully friendly, that is often built on implicit understanding as opposed to explicit. It's often built on, and you often are learning through informal means like observation and anecdote, and not necessarily through instruction. Clearly you are instructed, you're at a university, and instructions happen. But just as much, many of the things that you know how to do, and many of the ways that you see the world, have been done through, you have just picked up by virtue of living in the world and virtue of living with other people. And you've picked it up largely through these informal, and you could argue creative aspects, things that are like told to you, not even in the, again, not necessarily with that specific functional of like, son, I am going to instruct you on your way. But basically, you've heard your fathers, you've heard your mothers, you've heard your grandparents, you've heard your friends' stories, and you sort of generate a way of being in the world. And what's more, that's not always a good thing. I mean, it's not, I think it's a good thing to process, but remember, that's also how negative things can get stirred in. You could be living in a context, and I'm not throwing stones or anything, but you could be living in a context with racism and homophobia and ableism and heteronormativity and a whole bunch of different problems that you don't necessarily recognize are being communicated through stories and anecdote and joke, because they're not actually sort of officially instructed at you. So folklore, as well as being this sort of nice way of looking at how people sort of practice their traditions, and that's all very well and good, and I will go to the mat defending that aspect. One of the things we can also do is detect and help to shine light on the fact that there are potentially negative. In fact, I'll skip over potentially. There are negative aspects within these cultures that are picked up and learned almost by accident, that these cycles can perpetuate themselves through informal culture. So it has an edge to it. And once we recognize that, these things that we dismiss because they are so apparently trivial, because they are so apparently ephemeral, these things that that's just some weird stuff that we do. You should judge me on A, B, and C. It's like, well, sure, I'll judge you on A, B, and C. I will deem you on A, B, and C, but I'm not going to forget that you actually lived most of your time here. And that's also, again, for positive, all the sort of positive attributes. Well, I'm going to throw some shade, and there might be something there. And so if we can get people to remind ourselves that we do that these things have value and they also have risk, I think the world is a better place. Hence why you took this course. You were going to sign up and you've signed up and you thought, I'm going to learn all about elves. And maybe you did. That's what the essays and the assignments are for. But just as importantly, I think you made a connection between an elf and a racist joke and a barn. And if you haven't, go over your notes. Anyway, be well, my friends. I hope to see you virtually and sometime actually in face-to-face sometime in the future. Have a good end of semester. Have a good life. And I will see you hopefully soon. Bye-bye.